I walked into my own living room and nearly had a heart attack when I saw a half-naked man sprawled across my couch eating Cheetos. For a split second I thought I had the wrong house, until I spotted my grandmother's antique clock hanging right where I left it. Before I could ask a single question, the guy looked up, screamed like he saw a ghost, and shouted for his girlfriend. She came running out of my bedroom in my college hoodie, holding a hairdryer and yelling back at him, asking why he was yelling at the Airbnb host. That's when I realized something was very, very wrong. Because I wasn't the Airbnb host. I was the owner of the house. And I had never rented it out. 6 months earlier, I had taken a federal cybersecurity contract overseas. It was a high-clearance, time-sensitive job that required total radio silence for months. I left my home in the supposedly quiet little neighborhood of Crestline Meadows under the assumption that my property would be safe, thanks to a professionally monitored alarm system and the gated HOA-controlled community. My plan was simple. Finish the job, return home, hug my wife, maybe drink a beer on my porch. What I did not expect was to find strangers acting like they owned the place while my key no longer worked in the door. It had started the moment I stepped out of the Uber. The lawn looked way too clean. My custom solar lights had been replaced with cheap garden spikes. The porch had an unfamiliar mat that read "Welcome Sunshine." My pulse started to rise. I walked up to the front door, pulled out my key, and nothing. It didn't fit. I knocked. The guy who answered looked confused for a second, then grinned and said check-in wasn't until 3. I told him I owned the house and he laughed, like a bad sitcom extra, and said, "Sorry bro, this is an Airbnb now. Go argue with Karen." He didn't even ask my name. When the police came, I thought things would clear up. But the moment they saw the rental agreement the guy printed off his phone, they started looking at me like I was the intruder. I tried explaining that I had never put my house up for rent. They told me I had no proof, especially since the renters had been there a few days already. Apparently, squatter laws in our state meant that if someone was already occupying the home with a lease, even a fake one, I had to go to court to evict them. Evict. From my own house. I slept at a hotel that night, fuming. I was calling my wife, who was supposed to be in the house, but her phone kept going to voicemail. We had hit a rough patch before I left, but she promised she'd still be there when I came back. Now her car was gone, the house was full of strangers, and I had no clue where she was. The idea that she had something to do with it crossed my mind, but deep down I knew this stunk of something bigger. Something more systemic. Something more HOA. I went to see Greg, my neighbor 2 houses down, who had always seemed like the only normal person on our block. When I told him what happened, he looked uncomfortable. Then he spilled. Apparently, 3 months after I left, the HOA claimed my house was abandoned. They said it violated community guidelines to leave a house unoccupied for more than 60 days. They issued warnings, then fines, then got a locksmith to change the locks under something they called temporary property management right. Greg showed me one of the flyers. It had a bold headline that read "Protecting Crestline Property Values." At the bottom, it listed the HOA president's number, Karen Myers. It was like every HOA horror story on Reddit had come to life and pitched a tent in my front yard. I called the locksmith company, pretending to be a curious homeowner wanting a lock change. The receptionist was too chatty for her own good. She mentioned that they had done a job at my address months ago on request from the HOA president. When I pushed, she said, "Oh yeah, the lady even had paperwork saying she was managing the property." She seemed real official. The next bombshell came when I searched my own address online. My jaw dropped. My home had been listed on at least 4 different rental platforms. The photos were recent. They'd even included pictures of my artwork and custom furniture. Reviews mentioned how Karen was an attentive host who checked in often. One reviewer raved about the great sound system in the living room. That sound system cost more than my car. And someone else had been enjoying it for months. At this point, I knew I needed legal help. But lawyer after lawyer either said it was a civil matter that would take months to untangle or didn't want to go up against the HOA. One said something that stuck with me. If you want this resolved quickly, you need proof of fraud. Or someone with authority to open that can of worms. That's when I remembered something critical. During my contract work, I helped the Federal Cybercrime Division install a pattern recognition system for real estate wire fraud. I still had access to the tools, and I still had friends in high places. My blood boiled and my brain raced at the same time. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity or bad paperwork. Karen had impersonated me. She had forged leases. She had moved people into my house, collected rent, and banked the profit. This was organized, intentional fraud. And if I could track her digital activity back to her own computer, I could have enough to trigger a federal investigation. But I didn't just want justice. I wanted impact. I wanted to walk into that house and make sure Karen and every smug board member who rubber-stamped her madness knew they messed with the wrong man. The kind of man who spent years protecting classified data and hunting down cybercriminals. The kind of man who could write a script that would make their entire operation light up like a Christmas tree on a government database. I called in a favor. My old contact at the Department of Homeland Security picked up after one ring. When I explained what had happened and the data I had already collected, he whistled. "That's not just shady," he said. "That's criminal. And if she crossed state lines with that income? We're talking federal charges." He asked if I was willing to sign an affidavit and possibly accompany a team when they served a warrant. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. The plan started forming quickly. I'd use a spoofed account to pose as a potential renter and see if Karen responded from an identifiable device. I'd tag the communication with a tracking beacon. If she opened it from an HOA office device, game over. I'd collect screenshots, guest messages, payment info, enough to present a digital trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to her. Then we'd escalate. This time, not through some sleepy local court, but through federal channels. As I hung up the phone, I looked back at my house. Someone was on the balcony, drinking coffee in my robe. They waved. I waved back, but not with my hand. I was done being polite. They wanted to rent my house without asking. Fine. But they better enjoy it fast. Because I was coming home, with a SWAT warrant in my back pocket. The next morning, I woke up in the hotel room still seething, but with a kind of razor-sharp focus I hadn't felt since my fieldwork days. I brewed a weak cup of coffee from the machine that might have been older than the building and sat at the small desk, spreading out my note. Every instinct in me said Karen wasn't just freelancing this. There was a method to her madness, a system in place. She wasn't just stealing a house. She was operating a quiet business, likely with the silent approval of the rest of the HOA board or, at minimum, their willful ignorance. That made this bigger than a neighbor dispute. This was organized real estate fraud camouflaged in HOA jargon. And I was going to unravel it from the inside out. I started with the rental listings. I knew that property management systems typically use the same email aliases across different platforms. I tracked the Airbnb account back to a Gmail address under the name KarenHost247. Obvious. But when I cross-searched it across platforms, I found the same email had been used on VRBO, Booking.com, and even a luxury vacation rental site for executive retreats. My house had been marketed as a safe, secure executive smart home getaway for business travelers. I nearly choked reading it. These weren't short-term stays. She had booked entire months at a time, 2 of them while I was still under contract overseas. I clicked on a listing and sent a fake inquiry message asking about long-term corporate housing. Less than an hour later, I got a response from Karen herself. She claimed to be the property manager acting on behalf of a traveling government employee. The irony was laughable. She even said that, "The owner trusts me to make sure his house remains active and profitable." I tagged the response with a hidden tracker and waited. Within minutes, the beacon pinged. The IP address bounced back from the Crestline Meadows HOA office. That was the first nail in the digital coffin. The rest of the evidence came in like a flood. Using data scraping scripts I had designed years ago for foreign cybercrime networks, I quietly collected reviews, metadata, contact logs, payment receipts, and calendar bookings associated with that email. Each one was another thread connecting Karen directly to the unauthorized rental scheme. I even discovered she had listed other homes in the neighborhood. At least 4. One of which was supposed to belong to a retired Army veteran currently recovering out of state. The woman was flipping people's homes like Monopoly cards. By late afternoon, I had a thick enough digital trail to choke a server. But I didn't stop there. I drove back to Crestline Meadows, parked a block away, and walked the perimeter of my property. I noticed new security cameras had been installed, likely by Karen. But I also noticed something better. My old camera, hidden in the birdhouse by the garage, was still active. She'd missed it. It was battery-backed, motion-triggered, and uploaded footage to a cloud storage I still had full access to. When I logged in that evening, I found hours of clips. There was footage of Karen entering my house with a clipboard, sometimes with strangers following behind her. One clip showed her leading a group through the kitchen, pointing out appliances. Another had her scolding a guest who left the gate open, saying, "This isn't a frat house." The gall of this woman was breathtaking. The final piece came 2 days later. I received a tip from my contact at Homeland Security. The affidavit I submitted, combined with the digital evidence and the tracker ping, was more than enough to open a federal investigation. But since I was the property owner and a direct victim, they invited me to accompany the agents when the search warrant would be executed, both at the HOA office and, if necessary, at my home. I didn't hesitate. I signed the clearance paperwork and asked one thing: let me ride along. I didn't want to just read about justice. I wanted to feel it happen. The plan was simple. The warrant would be served simultaneously at 2 locations. A federal team would enter the HOA office, seize computers, records, and surveillance backup. A second team would secure my house, remove any current occupants, and preserve the interior for evidence processing. I had to act as a witness and sign off on any claims to my personal belongings. It was dry work on paper, but in my head it was fireworks. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't angry. I was focused, dangerous, and methodical. The Karen empire was about to fall. Before the operation, I received a call from the detective assigned to coordinate with the federal team. He had reviewed my footage and raised an eyebrow at one particular clip. Karen had entered my garage and taken down a few boxes. She left with what looked like mail. Possibly my forwarded documents, old bills, maybe even packages. That, he explained, crossed another line. Tampering with federal mail. Combined with the digital fraud and property misrepresentation, we were now looking at charges stacked so high she could use them as a podium. He said with a grin, "We're gonna need a bigger folder." The night before the raid, I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. I sat in the hotel room with my laptop open, watching the quiet street view of my house on a private feed. Inside were 2 guests, a middle-aged couple from Colorado who had no idea they were part of a federal sting operation. They were watching a cooking show in my living room, the same one I used to fall asleep in. Part of me felt sorry for them. The other part reminded me that they were sleeping in my bed. At sunrise, we rolled out. I was suited up in a plain black vest labeled Observer. I wasn't technically allowed to enter until the building was cleared, but they let me stand just behind the lead agents as we approached the HOA office. Karen's car was parked out front. As the lead agent knocked and announced, "Department of Homeland Security, open up with a warrant," I could already hear the movement inside. Shuffling, papers rustling, a lock clicking. She was trying to run. But it was too late. The door burst open, agents poured in, and Karen stood in the hallway clutching a folder and wearing a bathrobe that looked like it belonged in a hotel spa. Her face went pale when she saw me standing there behind the agent. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. One of the agents calmly took the folder from her hand. Another asked her to sit. She looked like she had aged 10 years in 10 seconds. While that chaos unfolded inside the HOA office, a second team executed the warrant on my house. I got updates over the radio. The guests were removed without issue. Agents found multiple documents labeled guest agreements, emergency override forms, even fake signatures supposedly written by me. Every single one was going straight into evidence. The home was preserved, swept, and sealed until I could return and verify its contents personally. I watched as Karen was read her rights. She didn't fight it. She didn't argue. She just looked at me with glassy eyes, like she couldn't believe someone had actually fought back. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just looked her dead in the eyes and said the one thing I'd been waiting weeks to say. You should have never rented out my house. Because now, it's my turn to move back in. And this time, I brought backup. The energy inside the HOA office felt like someone had kicked over a wasp's nest, and then calmly sat back to sip lemonade. Karen sat in a metal chair, arms crossed tightly over her robe as agents moved swiftly around her, collecting hard drives, files, and a mess of paper ledgers from behind the front desk. She looked both confused and betrayed, like someone who couldn't process how her empire was unraveling in broad daylight. I stood just inside the door, quiet and unblinking, watching her struggle to hold onto whatever thin thread of control she believed she still had felt more satisfying than any angry confrontation ever could have been. Her eyes darted to me once, then quickly away. The confidence was gone, and now all that was left was fear. The same woman who had laughed in a voicemail about how we had to do what's best for the neighborhood was now silent, surrounded by agents bagging up evidence of her crimes. The lead investigator leaned in and handed her a document. It was a list of charges: federal wire fraud, mail tampering, impersonation, unlawful rental activity under false ownership, and obstruction. As he read through them, her face began to tremble, especially when he got to the part about the possibility of prison time. She tried to protest weakly, something about authorized custodianship and protecting property values, but the investigator simply pointed at the document again. You used forged signatures to collect rental income from properties you didn't own. That's not custodianship. That's fraud. Outside, I could hear the second team finishing up at my house. Over the radio, one of the agents confirmed that all current guests had vacated the premises and the home had been sealed for return to the rightful owner, me. A sense of surreal calm washed over me. I wasn't just getting my house back. I was getting it back by watching justice land like a hammer on the very person who thought she could trample over people's rights and walk away smiling. Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She had orchestrated a months-long scam that preyed on people who trusted the HOA to protect them, not exploit them. As the agents loaded up the boxes of evidence, one called me over to a particular cabinet they'd found in the back. Inside were individual folders labeled with house numbers. Mine was there, along with the veteran's house Greg had mentioned and 3 more I didn't recognize. Each folder contained printed Airbnb confirmation pages, financial logs, hand-drawn maps of property layouts, and printed IDs that were clearly doctored. In mine, someone had scanned my actual ID and altered the address to make it seem like I lived elsewhere, as if I were out of state. There were also printed emails she had written to rental guests pretending to be my assistant. Each one ended with, "Thank you for staying at our lovely home." She had even forged thank you notes. The woman didn't just rent out my house. She created an entire fictional character to justify it. A younger agent in the corner suddenly spoke up, calling everyone's attention to something on the screen. They decrypted part of a hard drive and found a spreadsheet, Karen's private rental tracker. It listed dates, payments, guest names, and properties. According to the file, she had earned over $70,000 in rental fees from just my property alone. My hands clenched involuntarily. $70,000. While I was working 12-hour days halfway around the world, She had been throwing parties and pocketing cash from strangers lounging in my bed. Every dollar she earned was a reminder that she thought I'd never come back, that I'd stay quiet, that I wouldn't fight. We left the HOA office as Karen was placed in the back of a black SUV, no cuffs, just silence. She didn't scream or cause a scene. She just stared forward like someone replaying their whole life in reverse. As she disappeared behind tinted windows, the neighborhood around us began to stir. Word was spreading. Residents were outside, some in bathrobes, some with coffee mugs, all watching in hushed curiosity as the scene unfolded. Greg jogged up to me, eyes wide. "Holy hell," he said. "You really brought the cavalry." I nodded and told him what they had found. He shook his head. "People trusted her, man. She fined a kid for having a tricycle in his front yard. And now this." We drove straight to my house afterward. When I walked through the front door again, for the first time without interference, it felt like stepping into a movie set of my life. Same furniture, same layout, but used and rearranged in ways that didn't belong. The smell was different. The air had that fake citrus scent you get in cleaning sprays used in rentals. I walked through the living room and into the kitchen. Someone had left an open bag of groceries on the counter. I opened the fridge. Full. Condiments that weren't mine. Soy milk. An oat creamer I never bought. Everything screamed invasion. But the strangest part was what was missing. Some of my personal keepsakes had been moved or boxed away, almost like Karen had tried to stage the home, neutralize its identity. She'd tried to erase me from it. I walked into the bedroom and saw new sheets on the bed. A spa brochure was laid out on the nightstand. That's when the anger hit again, not just at her but at the entire HOA culture that made this possible. The unchecked authority. The smugness. The belief that homeowners were just tenants who could be managed like misbehaving pets. That ends now. I took out my phone and started a detailed video walkthrough of the property, documenting every change, every removed object, every scrap of unauthorized material. Then I uploaded it anonymously to the neighborhood Facebook group with a simple caption. "This is what your HOA president was doing behind your back." The video spread like wildfire. Comments exploded. Some expressed shock, some defended Karen out of ignorance, and others piled on with their own stories. One guy claimed Karen tried to fine him for growing vegetables. Another said she replaced their mailbox without permission and charged them a fee for installation labor. The floodgates had opened. People weren't just upset, they were furious. And now that they saw what had happened to me, they began to look at their own properties with suspicion. How many other houses had she accessed? How many other scams were running quietly under the surface? The morning after Karen was taken into custody, I woke up to nearly 100 notifications on my phone. The neighborhood was buzzing. My video walkthrough had gone viral across multiple homeowner groups, and a local news page had already reposted it under the headline, "HOA President Allegedly Rents Out Homes She Doesn't Own." I scrolled through comment after comment, some people expressing total shock, others chiming in with personal stories about being fined, bullied, or mysteriously losing packages after filing complaints against Karen. A retired couple from 3 blocks over claimed they'd been pressured to vacate their home temporarily for roof inspections that never happened. Another person shared screenshots of Karen threatening them with HOA fees over their patriotic flag display. The narrative had flipped overnight. Karen wasn't just a misguided president. She was now the villain in a community-wide drama everyone had apparently been waiting to write themselves into. I got a call from the detective on the case just before noon. They'd finished their preliminary review of the files seized from the HOA office. He told me what I already suspected. Karen had been operating a personal rental racket under the guise of HOA power. The board members claimed they were unaware, but the files showed several suspicious signatures and forms that had been quietly approved or simply never reviewed. They were now launching a deeper investigation into the entire board. The detective asked if I'd be willing to testify not just in the criminal case against Karen, but also in the civil negligence suit that other homeowners were now preparing. I told him yes, without hesitation. Later that afternoon, I returned to the HOA office with an attorney and a security consultant to oversee the extraction of my personal information and data from their systems. Walking through the building again, it struck me just how much Karen had tailored the space for herself. There were framed photos of her at community events, certificates with her name in bold letters, and a locked drawer filled with branded HOA merchandise, pens, notepads, keychains. She had built herself a throne out of printer paper and passive-aggressive policy forms. And now the crown was gone. While my consultant pulled files, I noticed a small portable drive labeled Guest Packages. Plugged in, it opened a folder with subfolders named by address. Inside mine were photos of my house, the rooms, instructions for guests, even calendar reminders of when guests were checking in or out. It was chilling. I was looking at a record of people staying in my house without me knowing, walking around barefoot on my floors, using my dishes, sleeping in my bed. I took the drive, not just for evidence, but because I needed to know what had been done while I was away. This wasn't just about invasion of property, it was deeply personal. The next HOA meeting, originally planned as a routine update, was now a full-blown town hall crisis session. Over 60 people showed up, some bringing chairs from home, some standing along the back wall. The board members looked shaken. Without Karen at the helm, they had no idea how to lead. The interim president, a meek man named Harold, tried to maintain order as the crowd erupted into demands for transparency, accountability, and immediate resignations. People shouted over one another, waving documents and screenshots, calling for a complete dismantling of the current board. When Harold spotted me in the crowd, he asked if I'd be willing to speak. I hadn't planned to, but the moment I stood, the room went quiet. All eyes turned to me, not with hostility, but with expectation. I walked to the front and took a breath. I told them the story, my story, from the beginning. About the first moment I found strangers in my home, about the locksmith, about the digital trail Karen left behind, and about how the authorities had confirmed that she exploited legal gray areas to seize control of properties she had no right to touch. I told them that I wasn't the only one, that several others in the room had been targeted too, whether they knew it yet or not. Then I told them the part that got the biggest reaction. That Karen made over $200,000 in under a year from homes she didn't own. That the HOA bylaws were riddled with vague clauses she had used to justify her takeover. That unless they rewrote those documents and installed a board that actually protected their interests, this kind of abuse could happen again. I didn't ask for applause, but I got it anyway. After the meeting, dozens of neighbors came up to thank me. Some offered to help with my lawsuit. Others offered their own surveillance footage, emails, even old voice messages Karen had left them. A young couple who had almost lost their home due to Karen's mysterious fire code violations handed me a thumb drive with recorded phone calls. A man who had served on a previous version of the HOA board years ago revealed that Karen had been pushing for total control ever since she moved in. He showed me a years-old memo she wrote about streamlining community property access. She had been planning this for a long time. With all the support and fresh evidence pouring in, my attorney filed an expanded civil suit not just for property damages, but for emotional distress, lost income, defamation, and willful invasion of privacy. The total? A cool $250,000. When the news broke, even more residents jumped on board. A class action suit was now forming against the HOA itself. The new narrative wasn't just about Karen. It was about a system that let someone like her go unchecked for so long. Karen, meanwhile, had retained a high-powered lawyer and was pleading not guilty. She claimed the rentals were part of a community improvement initiative meant to offset rising dues. Her defense? That she had verbal approval from several homeowners who later forgot. The judge didn't look impressed. Especially not after the footage I submitted showing her entering my garage and stealing my mail. The court date was set, and the local news was already planning to attend. Karen had finally gotten the attention she always wanted. Just not the kind she could control. A week before the trial, I got a letter. From Karen. Handwritten, shaky, probably dictated. She apologized, not for what she did, but for the confusion it caused. She asked if I'd considered dropping the charges and letting the community heal. I tore the letter in half and dropped it in the trash. Healing starts with accountability, not manipulation disguised as remorse. That evening, I was asked to attend an emergency HOA board meeting. The remaining members looked rattled and desperate for damage control. They apologized profusely, claimed ignorance, said Karen acted alone. I told them that wouldn't be enough. I wanted a full audit of every transaction from the past year. I wanted every key and lock changed. And I wanted the bylaws rewritten to prevent this from ever happening again. And then I delivered the final blow. I told them that I was filing a civil lawsuit for damages and losses, and not just against Karen, but against the HOA as an entity for negligence and mismanagement. The room went dead silent. When I walked out of the meeting, Greg was waiting by the door. "That might be the first honest HOA meeting I've seen in 10 years, he said. I smirked. "It won't be the last. Not if I have anything to say about it." He clapped me on the back. "You're gonna run for the board, aren't you?" I didn't answer, but the thought had already started to settle in my mind. Because there was no way I was going to walk away now. Not after everything. The house was mine again. But this wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about reclaiming the whole neighborhood from people like her. That night, I sat on my porch with a cold beer, finally breathing easy. The stars were out, the wind was soft, and for once, it felt like I was truly home. But deep down, I knew the fight wasn't over. Karen's arrest was only the beginning. What came next would shake the entire HOA system from the inside out. And I was ready for it. The sun rose on Crestline Meadows like it always did, casting long shadows over manicured lawns and regulation-approved flower beds, but something felt different now. The air carried less tension. It was quieter, not just in sound, but in atmosphere. Karen was gone. Her influence, once spread like a mold over the community, had evaporated. It wasn't just about the court ruling anymore. It was about the symbolic collapse of unchecked power. I sat on my porch with my coffee, no longer watching strangers walk in and out of my house, no longer fearing the next HOA letter stuffed in my mailbox. My house was mine again, and for the first time in nearly a year, it felt like the neighborhood belonged to the people, not just one woman's warped idea of order. The aftermath of the trial created a ripple effect I hadn't anticipated. Karen's conviction and the mounting civil suits forced the entire HOA board to resign within 2 weeks. One of them tried to argue they had no knowledge of her schemes, but the residents weren't buying it anymore. The community came together, tired of the excuses, and demanded a full restructuring. Emergency elections were held, and I was asked to run. At first, I hesitated. I didn't want to get pulled back into the politics, the meetings, the drama, but then I realized that stepping away would leave the door open for another Karen to emerge. So I ran. And I won. My first order of business as HOA president wasn't just to rewrite the bylaws. It was to rewrite the entire tone of how the neighborhood operated. We removed all language that gave the board ambiguous authority over private property. We eliminated absurd fines, created an online public record of all board decisions, and, most importantly, installed a policy that required resident majority approval before any structural changes or property access could be initiated. Transparency was no longer a suggestion, it was the standard. I launched a series of town halls that didn't just address rules but invited open conversation. People came out in droves, bringing snacks, folding chairs, and their kids. It felt like a block party disguised as civic engagement. Greg stepped up as the new vice president. The retired couple that Karen had threatened over their tomato plants? They were now leading the community garden initiative. The woman who Karen fined for her unauthorized lawn art was appointed to head the new Creative Expression Committee. A community that had been micromanaged into submission was now blooming again, wild and authentic. Karen, meanwhile, disappeared from the public eye. After her sentencing, she sold her house under quiet terms and moved 2 counties over. I later heard she tried to start a blog about leadership in gated communities, but it was flooded with comments and 1-star reviews quoting her arrest and trial. Her name became a cautionary tale, a local legend. Children probably whispered about her like a myth, warning each other to stay inside or else Karen of Crestline would fine them for breathing too loudly. The class action lawsuit moved forward, and the settlement reached by the group brought in enough restitution to fund several long overdue improvements around the neighborhood. We repaired the pool that had been closed for 3 summers, repaved cracked sidewalks, and finally installed the speed bumps parents had been asking for since 2017. The funds also allowed us to host a proper community festival for the first time in over a decade, complete with food trucks, music, a pet parade, and a dunk tank where Greg volunteered to be soaked for charity. I was supposed to sit in the tank too, but the line was so long for Greg that they never got to me. He still swears I rigged it, but I just smile and sip my lemonade. With the home finally back to normal, I went through each room and made small but deliberate changes. Not because I wanted to erase the past, but because I wanted to reclaim the space entirely. I replaced every curtain, scrubbed every floorboard, and even repainted the guest bathroom a deep blue instead of the awful beige Karen had chosen to neutralize it. I threw out the furniture she brought in and restored my grandmother's antique rocking chair to the corner where it belonged. The dented suitcase I found in the garage, full of old renter towels and unwashed linens, I burned in a backyard bonfire with neighbors gathered around, cheering as the smoke curled into the sky. One day, while working in the garage, I found an envelope taped behind a beam. It was addressed to me. Inside was a letter from my wife, the one who had vanished while I was overseas. She had left months ago, frustrated with the HOA harassment and my long absences. She said she'd tried to warn me in emails that never went through. She said Karen had pressured her, accused her of squatting, and threatened legal action. Rather than stay and fight, she had returned to her family in Nevada. The final line crushed me. I didn't know how to reach you, and by the time I could, it was too late. I drove to Nevada 2 weeks later. We sat across from each other at a small diner, unsure at first what to say. Eventually, the words came. She had watched the trial, seen the footage, followed everything from a distance. She had thought I might never come back, might just let the house go. But when I didn't, when I fought, she said she saw the version of me she'd fallen in love with all over again. We didn't fix everything that day, but we started to. She came back for a visit the following month. Then another. Eventually, she moved back in. This time on her terms. Our terms. We added new locks, a new camera system, even a motion-activated sprinkler Karen would have hated. But the biggest change wasn't physical, it was the atmosphere. People stopped whispering. They stopped walking on eggshells. Neighbors actually talked to each other now, not just in passing but in real ways. Birthdays were celebrated. Disagreements were settled like adults. Kids played in the cul-de-sac without being scolded for chalk drawings or riding scooters. For the first time, Crestline Meadows felt like a neighborhood instead of a dictatorship. One afternoon, I found myself standing at the edge of the lawn, looking at the spot where Karen had once installed an unauthorized sign reminding residents of noise regulations. That sign was long gone. In its place, I put up something simple, a small wooden plaque that read "Welcome Home." It wasn't a grand statement, just a quiet declaration that the era of fear was over. As time passed, the memory of what happened faded for some, but not for me. Not because I couldn't let go, but because I wouldn't allow complacency to return. Karen had thrived in silence, in assumptions. That wouldn't happen again. The system we built now had accountability baked into its bones. No single person could ever do what she did again, not without the full scrutiny of their neighbors.